Before we begin this incredible true story, please subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon so you never miss our best emotional stories. Now, let's dive into this thrilling tale. The rain hammered against the tall windows of the British Museum as Thomas Clark stood at his post near the Egyptian galleries. His polished boots reflected the dim emergency lighting that had flickered on moments ago. Something was wrong. In his 15 years as a royal guard at the museum, Thomas had developed an instinct for danger. And tonight every nerve in his body screamed that trouble had arrived. The main power had cut out exactly 3 minutes ago. Thomas glanced at his watch, noting the time with military precision. His hand moved instinctively to the radio clipped to his belt, but it produced only static. The communication system was down. This was no ordinary power failure. His training kicked in immediately. Someone had planned this carefully. Through the darkness, Thomas heard a sound that made his blood run cold. It was the faint scraping of metal against stone, coming from the direction of the Greek sculpture wing. He moved silently along the marble corridor, his years of military service guiding each careful step. The museum at night was a different world, filled with shadows that danced across priceless artifacts worth millions of pounds. Thomas had always loved this place. As a young boy growing up in Manchester, he had visited the British Museum with his grandmother. She had held his small hand and told him stories about the treasures inside, about history and honor and protecting what mattered. When he joined the army at 18, he carried those memories with him through 2 tours of duty. After leaving military service, becoming a royal guard at the museum felt like coming home. He was protecting not just objects, but the stories of human civilization itself. The scraping sound grew louder. Thomas pressed himself against a column, peering around the edge. In the faint moonlight, streaming through the high windows, he saw them. 4 figures dressed in black, moving with practiced efficiency around the Parthenon sculptures. They wore night vision goggles and carried specialized equipment. This was no amateur operation. His mind raced through the protocols. With communications down and backup at least 10 minutes away, he was alone. The sensible thing would be to observe and report, to wait for reinforcements. But Thomas knew these sculptures. He knew their history, their irreplaceable value. If these thieves succeeded, pieces of ancient Greece would be lost forever, possibly destroyed or hidden away in some private collection where the world would never see them again. The leader of the group, a tall man with broad shoulders, directed the others with hand signals. They were preparing to remove one of the marble friezes from the wall. Thomas recognized their technique. They had done this before. These were professionals, part of an organized gang that had likely hit other museums across Europe. Thomas remembered his grandmother's words from all those years ago. She had survived the London Blitz, had seen the museum damaged by bombs, had watched as treasures were hidden away to protect them from Nazi raids. She had taught him that some things were worth standing up for, even when the odds seemed impossible. He took a deep breath and stepped out from behind the column. His voice rang out clear and strong across the gallery. The 4 figures froze, their heads snapping toward him in surprise. They had not expected anyone to find them so quickly. Thomas stood his ground, projecting a confidence he did not entirely feel. He was one man against 4 criminals, who were certainly armed and dangerous. The tall leader slowly removed his night vision goggles. Even in the darkness, Thomas could see the cold calculation in the man's eyes. This was someone who had hurt people before, someone who would not hesitate to do so again. The other 3 gang members spread out, trying to flank Thomas on both sides. They moved like a pack of wolves, circling prey. Thomas calculated his options in seconds. The nearest alarm panel was 20 meters behind him. If he could reach it, he could trigger a silent alert that would bring armed police within minutes. But turning his back on these men would be suicide. He needed to keep them talking, keep them focused on him until he found an opportunity. The leader spoke in a low, accented voice. He was Eastern European, possibly Romanian. He told Thomas to walk away, to pretend he had seen nothing. They would be gone in 5 minutes, and nobody needed to get hurt. Thomas recognized the tone. It was the same voice he had heard from enemy combatants during his military service. the voice of someone trying to avoid violence but fully prepared to use it. Thomas shook his head slowly. He told them the building was surrounded, that armed response units were already moving into position. It was a bluff, but he delivered it with absolute conviction. The gang members exchanged glances, certainty flickering across their faces for just a moment. That moment of hesitation was all Thomas needed. He had planted a seed of doubt. Now he needed to make it grow. The standoff stretched into an unbearable silence. Thomas could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. The gang leader studied him carefully, trying to determine if he was telling the truth about backup arriving. Thomas maintained eye contact, refusing to show any weakness. He had learned in the army that confidence could be as powerful as any weapon. One of the other gang members, shorter man with nervous energy, whispered something urgent to the leader. Thomas caught fragments of the conversation. They were arguing about whether to abort the mission or neutralize the threat he posed. The third member, a woman with her hair pulled back in a tight ponytail, moved closer to one of the sculptures, her hand resting on a crowbar. The fourth member remained silent, watching Thomas with the stillness of a predator. The leader finally spoke again. He asked Thomas why he was willing to die for old rocks and broken statues. It was a question meant to shake Thomas's resolve, to make him question the value of his sacrifice. But the gang leader had miscalculated. He did not understand what these artifacts meant to Thomas, or to millions of people around the world. Thomas thought about the school children who visited the museum every day, their eyes wide with wonder as they learned about ancient civilizations. He thought about the elderly couples who held hands while walking through the galleries, finding connection with the past. He thought about his grandmother, long gone now, who had believed that culture and history were worth preserving at any cost. These were not just old rocks. They were humanity's memory, carved in stone. He told the gang leader that he had taken an oath to protect this place. The words came out steady and clear. Thomas explained that some things mattered more than personal safety, that civilization itself depended on people willing to stand between thieves and treasures. The gang leader laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the marble walls. He said Thomas was a fool, that he would die for nothing. But something had shifted in the room. The nervous gang member was now openly questioning the leader, suggesting they should leave immediately. The woman with the crowbar had taken a step back from the sculptures. Only the silent fourth member remained unmoved, still watching Thomas with those predator eyes. Thomas pressed his advantage. He began describing the police protocols for museum breaches, speaking with the authority of someone who had been through countless training exercises. He mentioned helicopter units, armed response teams, and tactical specialists. Some of it was true. Some of it was embellishment. All of it was delivered with absolute conviction. He could see the doubt spreading among the gang members like a virus. The leader's jaw tightened. He was losing control of his crew, and he knew it. In desperation, he pulled a weapon from inside his jacket. It was a handgun, matte black and deadly in the moonlight. He pointed it directly at Thomas's chest. The message was clear. This ended now, one way or another. Thomas felt his stomach drop, but he forced himself to remain still. He had been in similar situations during his military service, had felt the cold certainty of death hovering nearby. Fear was natural, but panic was deadly. He kept his hands visible, palms open, showing he was not reaching for a weapon. His mind worked frantically, searching for any strategy that might defuse the situation. The museum seemed to hold its breath. Ancient Egyptian sarcophagi stood silent witness in the adjacent gallery. Greek gods frozen in marble watched from their pedestals. Centuries of history surrounded them, and in this moment, Thomas represented the thin line between civilization and chaos. Then something unexpected happened. The silent fourth gang member spoke for the first time. His voice was deep and carried a different accent, possibly Russian. He told the leader that killing a royal guard would bring down the full force of British law enforcement. They would never stop hunting them. Every border would be watched. Every contact would be compromised. The job was already blown. It was time to leave. The woman with the crowbar nodded in agreement. The nervous member was already backing toward the exit. The gang leader stood alone in his determination, his gun still pointed at Thomas. For a terrible moment, Thomas thought the man might shoot anyway, might pull the trigger just out of rage and frustration. But the leader was a criminal, not a fool. He lowered the weapon slowly, his face twisted with anger. He told Thomas that this was not over, that they would remember him. It was a threat, but it was also a retreat. The gang began moving toward the emergency exit they had used to enter the building. Thomas knew he should let them go, should count his blessings and call for backup. But another thought occurred to him. If these criminals escaped, they would hit another museum, another cultural institution. They would steal and destroy until someone stopped them permanently. His grandmother's voice echoed in his mind once more. Some fights could not be avoided. As the gang reached the doorway, Thomas made a decision that would change everything. He moved. Thomas lunged for the alarm panel on the wall, his fingers stretching toward the red emergency button. The gang leader saw the movement and spun around, raising his weapon again. Time seemed to slow down as Thomas's hand connected with the button, pressing it hard. A silent alarm activated, sending signals to police stations across London. Help was finally coming. The leader cursed and rushed back toward Thomas. The other gang members hesitated in the doorway, torn between escape and loyalty to their leader. Thomas braced himself for impact, using his military training to position his body defensively. The leader swung the gun toward Thomas's head, using it as a club rather than firing it. Thomas ducked under the swing, drove his shoulder into the man's midsection. They crashed together into a display case containing ancient pottery. Glass shattered around them, and alarms began wailing throughout the museum. The secondary security system had activated, triggered by the broken case. Lights flooded the galleries, suddenly illuminating everything in harsh white brilliance. The night vision advantage the gang had possessed vanished instantly. Thomas and the leader grappled on the floor, rolling through broken glass and fragments of pottery. Thomas felt a sharp pain in his arm where glass had cut through his uniform, but adrenaline pushed the discomfort aside. The leader was strong and well-trained in hand-to-hand combat. He managed to get on top of Thomas, pressing his forearm against Thomas's throat, cutting off his air supply. The woman with the crowbar shouted something to the others. Thomas could not hear her words over the screaming alarms, but he saw the nervous member running back into the gallery. The man raised his crowbar, clearly intending to strike Thomas while he was pinned down. Thomas twisted his body desperately, trying to break free from the leader's hold. But the man was too strong. Just as the crowbar began its downward arc, the silent fourth member grabbed the nervous man's arm, stopping the blow. He shook his head firmly. No killing. The nervous member looked confused but lowered the crowbar. The woman was shouting something else now, pointing toward the main entrance. Through the ringing in his ears, Thomas heard new sounds. Police sirens. Multiple vehicles approaching fast. The backup had arrived far quicker than anyone expected. Later, Thomas would learn that an off-duty police unit had been patrolling nearby when the alarm activated. Sometimes luck favored the righteous. The gang leader heard the sirens too. His grip on Thomas's throat loosened slightly as he processed this new threat. It was the opening Thomas needed. Thomas brought his knee up hard, striking the leader in the ribs. The man grunted and rolled off. Thomas gasped for air, his throat burning, but forced himself to his feet. The gang was now trapped between Thomas and the approaching police. The main exit would lead them straight into armed officers. The emergency exit they had used to enter was in the opposite direction, which meant going past Thomas again. The leader stood up, breathing hard, his face flushed with rage and exertion. He still held the gun, and for a moment Thomas thought he might use it after all. The woman grabbed the leader's arm, speaking urgently. The sirens were louder now, very close. The sounds of boots on marble echoed from the main hallway. Commands were being shouted. The building was being surrounded. The gang made their choice. They ran toward the emergency exit, trying to push past Thomas. He could have let them go. He had done his job. The police would take over from here. But Thomas thought about all the other museums these criminals had robbed, all the artifacts that had been lost or destroyed. He thought about the curator in Amsterdam who had been beaten during their last heist, left with permanent injuries. These people needed to be stopped completely. Thomas grabbed the nervous member as he tried to run past. They collided with a marble column, and Thomas used the momentum to spin the man around and pin his arm behind his back. The nervous member dropped his crowbar with a clatter. The woman turned back to help her companion, raising her own crowbar to strike Thomas. But the silent fourth member intervened again. He grabbed the woman's arm and said something sharp in their language. Thomas did not understand the words, but the meaning was clear. It was over. They had lost. Fighting further would only make things worse. The woman lowered her crowbar slowly, her face full of frustration and defeat. The gang leader had not stopped running. He reached the emergency exit and pushed through the door, disappearing into the night. The silent member and the woman looked at each other, then at Thomas holding their companion. They could abandon him and run, or they could surrender. The police were seconds away now. Thomas could hear officers entering the gallery behind him. The silent member made a decision that surprised everyone. He sat down on the floor, placing his hands on his head in a gesture of surrender. The woman stared at him in disbelief, then looked at the doorway where the leader had fled. She seemed to be calculating her chances of escape. The police burst into the gallery at that moment, weapons drawn, shouting commands. Thomas released the nervous member and stepped back, raising his own hands to show he was not a threat. Officers surrounded the three gang members, forcing them to the ground and handcuffing them with practiced efficiency. A sergeant approached Thomas, asking if he was injured. Thomas touched his throat, which was already bruising, and looked at the cut on his arm. He would survive. A detective inspector arrived within minutes, a sharp-eyed woman named Sarah Chen, who had spent years tracking international art theft rings. She examined the scene carefully, noting the sophisticated equipment the gang had brought, the precision of their planning, and the damage to the display case. She turned to Thomas and asked him to explain exactly what had happened. Thomas walked her through the entire encounter. From the moment the power failed to the final capture, Detective Chen listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions. She was particularly interested in the gang leader who had escaped. Thomas described him in detail, his accent, his behavior, his obvious experience in leading criminal operations. Chen nodded grimly. She knew exactly who Thomas was describing. The gang they had partially captured was known across Europe as the Nighthawk Crew. They had successfully robbed museums in Paris, Berlin, Rome, and Amsterdam over the past 3 years. They specialized in ancient artifacts that could be sold to wealthy private collectors who cared nothing for history or culture. The gang had always escaped before police could respond, their planning meticulous, their execution flawless. Until tonight, Chen explained that the leader, whose name was Viktor Kozlov, was considered one of the most dangerous art thieves in the world. He had connections to organized crime syndicates in Eastern Europe and had evaded capture for over a decade. The 3 gang members in custody were valuable, but Viktor was the prize. Without him, the network would continue operating, recruiting new members and targeting new museums. Thomas felt a sinking sensation in his stomach. He had won the battle, but perhaps not the war. Viktor was still out there, still free to strike again. The detective saw the disappointment on his face and placed a hand on his shoulder. She told him that capturing 3 members of the Nighthawk crew was a massive victory. They would be interrogated, and perhaps someone would provide information that could lead to Viktor, as paramedics treated Thomas's injuries. He watched police investigators photograph evidence and dust for fingerprints. The museum director arrived, a distinguished elderly man named Sir Robert Hendricks, who had dedicated his life to preserving cultural heritage. He approached Thomas with tears in his eyes and shook his hand firmly. Thomas had saved treasures that belonged to all of humanity. There was no adequate way to thank him, but Thomas felt no sense of triumph. He kept thinking about Viktor somewhere out in the London night, planning his next move. The man had been desperate enough to almost shoot a royal guard. What would he do now, knowing his crew was captured and his operation compromised? Would he flee the country, or would he attempt something even more dangerous? The nervous gang member was loaded into a police van, still trembling. The woman went quietly, her face expressionless. But the silent 4th member, before being led away, caught Thomas's eye. He nodded slightly, a gesture of respect from one warrior to another. Then he was gone, disappearing into the back of the van. Detective Chen returned to Thomas with an update. The power had been cut at an electrical junction box 2 blocks away, a professional job that required knowledge of the museum's systems. Victor had planned this operation for months, studying security protocols and guard rotations. They had entered through a service entrance that was supposed to be locked, but had mysteriously been left unsecured. Chen suspected an inside accomplice, possibly a cleaning crew member or maintenance worker who had been bribed or threatened. Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. If there was someone inside the museum helping Victor, that person was still here, still watching. He mentioned this concern to Chen, who nodded seriously. She was already thinking the same thing. Every museum employee would need to be interviewed and investigated. Trust had been broken, and it would take time to restore. As dawn began breaking over London, casting golden light through the museum's high windows, Thomas finally allowed himself to feel the exhaustion that had been held at bay by adrenaline. His throat ached, his arm throbbed where the glass had cut him, and his entire body felt bruised from the fight. The paramedics wanted to take him to hospital for observation, but Thomas refused. He wanted to remain at the museum to ensure no further threats emerged. Detective Chen understood. She arranged for Thomas to rest in the security office while her team continued their investigation. As he sat in the small room, drinking hot tea that someone had brought him, Thomas thought about his grandmother. She would have been proud of him tonight. He knew. He had stood for something that mattered, had risked everything to protect the treasures she had loved. But the victory felt incomplete. Victor was still free. The Nighthawk crew had been damaged, but not destroyed. And somewhere in London, a dangerous criminal was making plans. Thomas closed his eyes, trying to rest, but sleep would not come. His instincts were still screaming that something was wrong, that the danger had not passed. He was proven right 2 hours later when Detective Chen burst into the security office, her face pale. The police van transporting the 3 captured gang members had been ambushed on its way to the station. Armed men had stopped the vehicle, overpowered the officers, and freed the prisoners. No one had been killed, but 2 officers were in hospital with serious injuries. The Nighthawk crew was together again. They had just made a very bold statement. Thomas stood up so quickly that his chair fell over. He asked Chen if she knew who had carried out the ambush. She nodded grimly. Witnesses had described the leader of the assault team. It was Victor. He had rescued his crew using a level of violence and coordination that shocked even experienced detectives. The message was clear. Victor protected his own. He was not afraid to strike at the police directly. Chen told Thomas something else that made his blood run cold. During the ambush, Victor had asked the officers about the guard who had interfered with their museum job. He wanted to know Thomas's name. Thomas felt a knot form in his stomach. Victor knew who he was now, knew he was the one who had ruined their carefully planned heist. The police officers had not given up his name during the ambush, but Victor had resources. It would not take him long to identify the royal guard who had been on duty that night. Thomas's life had just become significantly more dangerous. Detective Chen offered immediate protection. Police could watch his home, provide escorts, keep him safe while they hunted for Victor and his crew. But Thomas knew this solution was temporary at best. Victor had proven he was willing to attack police directly. Protection officers would slow him down but not stop him. The only way to truly end this threat was to capture Victor and dismantle the entire Nighthawk. Operation Thomas made a decision that Chen initially opposed. He would not hide. Instead, he would continue working at the museum, maintaining his normal routine. They would use him as bait, drawing Victor out into the open where police could capture him. Chen argued that this was far too dangerous, that Victor was unpredictable and violent. But Thomas was adamant. This was his fight now, and he intended to finish it. A plan was developed over the following hours. Thomas would return to his duties at the museum. But the building would be filled with undercover police officers posing as tourists and staff. Advanced surveillance would monitor every entrance and exit. If Victor made a move, they would be ready. It was risky, but it was also their best chance to end the threat posed by the Nighthawk crew. 3 days passed with no sign of Victor. Thomas worked his shifts, hyper-aware of every visitor who entered the galleries, every shadow in the corners. The undercover officers blended seamlessly into the museum environment, but Thomas could spot them if he looked carefully. They communicated through hidden earpieces, coordinating their positions to ensure Thomas was always protected. On the fourth night, something changed. Thomas was making his rounds through the Asian art section when he noticed a visitor who seemed out of place. The man was dressed casually in jeans and a jacket, but something about his posture, the way he held himself, triggered Thomas's military instincts. This was someone trained in combat, someone alert and assessing his environment. Thomas casually spoke into his own hidden microphone, alerting the undercover team to the suspicious visitor. Officers began converging on the area, moving slowly to avoid spooking their target. But when they approached the man, he produced legitimate identification and seemed genuinely confused by their interest. He was a martial arts instructor visiting from Japan and London for a conference. He was not connected to Victor. The false alarm left everyone on edge. Detective Chen began to wonder if Victor had left the country, if their trap would never spring. But Thomas's instincts told him otherwise. Victor had a reputation to protect. He had lost face when his operation failed. Men like him did not simply walk away from such failures. They sought revenge. That night, Thomas returned to his small flat in North London, accompanied by 2 protection officers who checked every room before allowing him inside. They positioned themselves outside his building, maintaining watch through the night. Thomas tried to sleep, but found himself staring at the ceiling, thinking about Victor and the Nighthawk crew. His phone rang at 2 in the morning. It was Detective Chen. She had received intelligence from Interpol about Victor's background. He was not just an art thief. He was former military intelligence from an Eastern European country, trained in psychological warfare and intimidation tactics. He was known for targeting anyone who interfered with his operations. Not immediately, but carefully, methodically, after thorough planning. The detective's voice was tense. Victor would not attack Thomas at the museum where security was high. He would strike somewhere unexpected. Thomas felt ice spread through his veins. If Victor was planning something elaborate, the protection officers outside might not be enough. He got out of bed and looked out his window. The street below was quiet, lit by orange street lamps. The protection officer's vehicle was parked directly across from his building. Everything appeared normal, but normal could be an illusion. A thought occurred to Thomas that made him sit down heavily. Victor was not coming for him tonight. Victor was going to target something Thomas cared about: the museum. Not to steal this time, but to destroy. To send a message that no one interfered with the Nighthawk crew without consequences. Thomas grabbed his phone and called Chen, explaining his theory. Chen immediately dispatched additional units to the British Museum. But by the time they arrived 15 minutes later, smoke was already rising from the building's west wing. Fire alarms were screaming. Victor had struck exactly as Thomas predicted, using the cover of night to plant incendiary devices throughout the galleries he had scouted during the failed heist. The message was clear and terrible. If Victor could not steal the treasures, he would burn them. Thomas was already running to his car, the protection officer scrambling to follow him. He broke every speed limit, racing across London toward the museum. The city's fire brigades were responding. But Thomas knew how fast fires could spread in old buildings filled with wooden displays and ancient fabrics. Priceless artifacts were being consumed by flames at this very moment. When Thomas arrived at the museum, the scene was chaos. Firefighters were battling multiple blazes throughout the building. Museum staff were evacuating, coughing from smoke inhalation. Sir Robert Hendricks stood outside, tears streaming down his face as he watched his life's work burning. Thomas ran toward the building, but firefighters blocked his path, telling him it was too dangerous to enter. Then Thomas saw something that made his heart stop. Security camera footage was being displayed on a mobile command center screen. Inside the burning museum, clearly visible through the smoke, was Victor. He was not fleeing. He was walking calmly through the galleries, watching the destruction he had caused. He was savoring his revenge. Thomas pushed past the firefighter blocking his path. He ignored the shouts behind him and ran into the burning museum, covering his mouth with his jacket sleeve. The heat was overwhelming, the smoke thick and choking. But Thomas knew these hallways better than anyone. He had walked them every day for 15 years. He could navigate them blind if necessary. Through the smoke, he spotted Victor's silhouette, moving toward the Egyptian galleries. Thomas followed, his eyes burning from the smoke, his lungs screaming for clean air. Victor seemed to sense he was being pursued and turned around. Even through the smoke and flames, Thomas could see the surprise on the man's face. Victor had not expected anyone to be foolish enough to enter a burning building to chase him. Victor ran deeper into the museum, toward the sections where the fire had not yet spread. Thomas pursued, driven by a rage he had never felt before. This man had not just tried to steal from humanity's heritage, he had tried to destroy it completely. Artifacts that had survived thousands of years were being reduced to ash because of one man's wounded pride. They reached the Great Court, the massive glass-roofed atrium at the museum's center. Smoke was pooling against the glass ceiling, creating an eerie fog. Victor stopped running and turned to face Thomas. He pulled out a knife, a wicked curved blade that glinted in the firelight reflected through the smoke. He told Thomas that he should have stayed out of this. He had brought this destruction upon the museum by interfering. Thomas felt no fear now, only determination. He told Victor that men like him destroyed beauty because they could not create it, that they stole history because they had no future. Victor's face twisted with anger. He lunged forward with the knife, fast and skilled. Thomas sidestepped, using his military training to avoid the blade. They circled each other in the smoke-filled atrium. Predator and protector locked in a final confrontation. Victor attacked again, slashing in a pattern meant to drive Thomas backward into the flames spreading from adjacent galleries. But Thomas had fought in close-quarters combat during his military service. He knew how to read an opponent's movements, how to use momentum against them. When Victor overextended on a thrust, Thomas grabbed his wrist and twisted hard. The knife clattered to the floor. They grappled hand to hand, crashing into display cases and columns. Victor was strong and well-trained, but Thomas had something Victor lacked: purpose. He was not fighting for money or reputation. He was fighting for every child who would never see these artifacts, for every future generation that would be robbed of their heritage. For his grandmother's memory and the values she had taught him, Thomas gained the upper hand, forcing Victor to the ground. Police officers burst into the Great Court at that moment. Having followed Thomas into the building despite orders to stay outside, they pulled Thomas away and handcuffed Victor, who struggled and cursed in multiple languages. Detective Chen was there too, coughing from smoke inhalation, her weapon drawn. But the victory was bittersweet. Around them, the British Museum burned. Firefighters were making progress, containing the blazes, but the damage was already catastrophic. Thomas stumbled outside with the others, breathing fresh air for the first time in what felt like hours. Paramedics wrapped him in a blanket and gave him oxygen. His hands were shaking from adrenaline and smoke inhalation. Over the following weeks, the true extent of the damage became clear. 3 galleries had been completely destroyed, including priceless Egyptian papyri and Greek pottery. Dozens of other artifacts had been damaged by smoke and water from the firefighting efforts. The cost was estimated in the hundreds of millions of pounds, but the true loss was immeasurable. Some things, once destroyed, could never be replaced. Victor and his crew were charged with attempted theft, arson, assaulting police officers, and a list of other crimes that would keep them in prison for decades. During interrogation, the silent fourth member, whose name was revealed to be Dmitri, provided extensive information about their operations across Europe. Museums that had been robbed years ago finally received answers. Stolen artifacts were recovered from private collections and returned to their rightful places. Thomas was awarded multiple honors for his bravery, including a commendation from the Queen herself. But he felt no joy in these ceremonies. Every night, he dreamed about the artifacts that had been lost in the fire. He questioned whether his actions had been worth the cost. If he had simply let the gang steal a few pieces during their first attempt, would the museum still be whole? Detective Chen visited him one evening at the museum, where he had returned to work despite everything. She found him sitting in front of a gallery that was being restored, staring at the empty walls. She told him something that changed his perspective. During Victor's trial, Evidence had emerged of his plans. If the first heist had succeeded, he intended to return repeatedly, taking more and more until the museum's security was so tight that he would burn the building anyway. Just to prove he could, the destruction had been inevitable. Thomas's interference had not caused it. Victor's madness had, and because of Thomas's actions, most of the museum had been saved. The damaged galleries represented perhaps 5% of the collection. The other 95% remained intact, protected, preserved for future generations. Thomas had not failed. He had saved immeasurably more than was lost. Months later, Thomas stood in the restored Egyptian gallery. New artifacts had been brought from storage to replace those destroyed. School children filled the room, listening to a guide explain the wonders of ancient civilization. An elderly woman stood near Thomas, holding her grandson's hand, telling him about history and honor. The scene reminded Thomas so much of his grandmother that tears filled his eyes. Sir Robert. Hendricks approached and stood beside Thomas in comfortable silence. After a moment, the director spoke. He said the museum had stood for centuries and would stand for centuries more because of people like Thomas. People who understood that some things were worth fighting for, worth risking everything to protect. Culture, history, beauty, truth, these were not luxuries. They were necessities that defined humanity itself. Thomas thought about Victor, now serving 30 years in prison. He thought about the Nighthawk crew, disbanded and scattered. He thought about the artifacts lost and the ones saved. Most of all, he thought about his grandmother's words from long ago. Some things were worth standing up for, even when the odds seemed impossible. She had been right. The museum had survived, battered but unbroken. And Thomas remained at his post, a guardian not just of objects, but of the stories they told. The connections they forged across time and space. Every night, he walked the galleries with renewed purpose. Every artifact he passed represented a victory against those who would destroy rather than preserve, steal rather than share, diminish rather than celebrate. The British Museum stood as a testament to human achievement and resilience. And Thomas Clark, a royal guard, who had once been a boy holding his grandmother's hand, played his part in ensuring it would continue standing for generations.